All right, so now let's start to get into fracturing. Fracturing, I mean, ridges can be used for all kinds of things. Ridges can denote even how hair works by having a whole bunch of sausage links of ridges chained together, cables, bowling balls with, bowling pins is a classic example. Now, what we're going to get into, though, is fracturing with the rest of these lessons. So we're just going to start going that direction. And that is one of the main uses of rigids, especially in, film and television. It's a lot of destruction stuff. So let us destroy this pig head thing. Although I'm just going to leave that one there. I'm going to call that one basics. I mean, we're probably not going to go back to that, but let's go into Voroni land over here, and we'll make the pig head again. There it is. So Voroni is a very simple, relatively speaking, algorithm for partitioning up space into smaller cells. And, what that means to me is destroying something, meaning break it up into fragments. Voroni is very fast and is particularly well suited to the bullet solver because it makes convex pieces. The problem with Voroni, as we'll see eventually, is on its own, it's not very sophisticated. Like the pieces it makes are pretty simple looking. It can be good enough if you have a lot of them or if you're far away. But mostly what we'll get into in the next lesson is how to cleverly combine Voroni's and other techniques to make your pieces look really good, even based off of a relatively simple Voroni algorithm. But we'll get into that another time. For now, let's just talk about Voroni itself. So I have the head. I turned it into a fog using the ISO offset. And then we're going to scatter points into it. It's too many for now. I'm just going to make 10. The fog is just so that I can put points inside of the pig head and not just on the surface. If I did this, the points would be limited to the very surface of it. By making the fog first, I can put points inside. The points are going to define essentially, not exactly, but essentially the centers of the Voroni pieces. Because the Voroni fracture node itself takes in the input geometry to fracture, okay, and the points for Voroni cells. So just by hooking those two things up, I mean, you're done at that point. I did touch on this in one of my volumes lessons, and now we're going to go into it a lot more on how Voroni actually works. We can visualize pieces to kind of see how that's working. It's fractured. It's made these, again, fairly simple, straight-lined fractures around the points that we scattered in. If I do an exploded view, we can pull them apart. Again, you can see how they are separate pieces now. It made new walls on the inside and everything. And there you go. By changing how many pieces I have, how many points I have rather, it's making more and more pieces. It's pretty fast, as you can see. I mean, even making like 600 pieces, 1,000 pieces, but they all are this convex kind of straight edge thing. And to reiterate, we'll go into that in the next lesson, how to make them look cool instead. But so how is this actually working? Like, how is it determining where these walls go? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because let's start with a simpler thing, a simpler example. Here's a grid. And we don't need to see this thing anymore. So let's take this grid and let's make it like twice as wide. And I also want to look at this just from the top down. Something like that. Cool. So we don't have these extra lines in our way. I'm going to bring this down to 2 and 2. I mean, you can have any number of those you want. As we saw with the pig head, it didn't matter that it already had, edges and things, but just so we can see easier. So, if I were to scatter some points on it, and let's just move this out of the way. I can scatter some points on it. I'm going to turn off relaxed iterations, because when you have relaxed iterations on, it'll keep redistributing where the points go. See how they're moving around like that? In fact, just to make your life a little easier, I'm going to make a sphere. I'm going to copy it to those points, and then we'll actually be able to see what I'm even talking about. And this is way too big, so Let's just make it like a quarter the size, something like that. Great. So as I add points, they're all jostling around. If I turn off relaxed iterations, they won't be evenly distributed, but they also don't keep jostling every time I add points to it. So let's start with like 2 points or something. So we've got this thing, and I want to Voronoi fracture that thing, which is the grid, based on these points. Move this over here, something like that. So there it is. Visualize pieces. Pretty crazy. Now, let's merge these together for a second. So we can see we've got 2 points here. What Voroni is doing, and if this is the main takeaway, what Voroni is doing is it's saying this point is the king of all of the land that's closer to him than any other point. So this area over here where my mouse is closer to this point than it is closer to this point. So he wins, so it becomes orange. This point over here, this area, is closer to this point than this is. So you can imagine, as we move farther and farther away, his grasp on it gets a little bit more tenuous. And once we get to the halfway point between these two, this area is now equally distant from this point as it is to this point. And then once we get past that halfway point to here, now this area is closer to this point than it is to this one. So it becomes gray because this gray one owns it. And that's how that works. That's literally, on a high level, that's the entirety of what Voroni is returning to you. Now let's see that a little better. I'm going to say, let's make a third point now. So it added this third point in. So again, 2 points, 3 points. This one now is introducing some trouble. This area up here away from the new guy is still under the thrall of these two. So they're still kind of fighting over it the way it was when there was just the two of them. Now there's this third one, and it's also has a midpoint between him, and it has a midpoint between him. And see how it switches over at the midpoints? It doesn't get to affect this far away because these areas are closer only to these two than it even is to this one. But anyway, it's by drawing lines between them. That's what the algorithm is doing. By drawing lines between them, it's finding the midpoint of those lines and saying, these are the boundaries. Crazy, right? Pretty clever. So I'm going to make another Voronoi fracture here and actually intentionally break it. So you can't do that, but I'm going to allow editing of contents. I'm going to go inside, and I just want this thing to return. Where's the input points? Oh, here we go. I want it to give me those lines. This is the part of the Voroni fracture that does that. So there they are. These are those lines that we were just talking about. See? So it's the halfways between these that does it. Now this halfway here is referring to up here, because again, this one's close. But that's essentially what's going on here. We could even do something like this. I'm going to add a color, a random color, to this scatter here that everyone's going to enjoy. I'll say, hey, you get a random color, and then this Voroni fracture is not going to do visualize based on this. I'm actually going to copy over that color that we just made over here. That way, our copy thing here can also stamp the color on. There we go. Cool. And we can also, let's say, I want to break this thing down. This was the triangle essentially that it had here. Not crease. I want to, real quick, and this is probably overkill, but I think it'll look nice. I'm going to take a carve. I'm just going to break that actual polygon triangle down into 3 primitives, 3 polylines instead, and that's what you can do with this setup. And again, this is not, that carve thing is more of just a fun trick maybe for you to use on your own later. That's not really rigid specific. But here's a poly wire so I can visualize the color change between them. And now I'll just add that into the mix here. Great. Oh, it's got no normals. Let's give it some normals. All right, good. So this guy does not have, not stamp inputs, use template point attributes. There we go. So now they have the colors. And so you can see this is purple, the king of purple, the king of green, the king of gray. And as this changes over at the midpoints, it switches. So let me drive that even more home. I'm going to put an edit here. And I can grab, so I went to edit, I pressed S2, it makes me allowable to select points. So you can see the selection thing there is turned on as I encapsulate it. Or you can click and hold this, go to box picking, click and hold this, go to points, that's the 2. You can select it, press T to move, and now you can see as I am able to grab it, holy shit, sorry, excuse my language, we can move this around, and you can see how the Voronoi fracture updates in real time. Just by grabbing any of these points, you can see the distances between them. That's what determines where these different fractured pieces are. You can hold them close together, like that. You can see as we approach an equilateral triangle, we get the opposite of it, the kind of a peace sign. So let's add some more points into this mix. And to add more points, we're going to need to reset any changes we made in the edit here, or else it's going to apply them to the wrong point. So here we go. I'm just going to add a whole bunch more of these. Cool. So now there's 14 of them. The same thing still applies. Now we have pieces in the middle, like this, and as they move around, as they get closer and farther from different points, and I can just move it all the way over here. It'll just keep updating which points it's closest to, and that's where it makes these triangles between them, where it just says, hey, who am I closest to? Bind me to them. And then find the midway points of a lot of different lines now, and that's how it does it. So what else can we learn from this? By putting lots of points together, you'll see it makes lots of little pieces, because now each little kingdom is still bound by the ones that are close to it. So by putting lots of guys in the corner here like this looks pretty cool. You see we have lots of little pieces, and then maybe by having these more spread out over here, it goes from little pieces to bigger pieces, and then finally to like maybe one big piece over there. So you can see, just by looking at just the Voronoi, this is the actual fracture that we got based on this distribution of points being here, or being, here. And it ends up looking like this. So I hope that makes sense. Oops, I had to go ruin it right there at the end. But that's what this is. Voronoi is completely where you have more points, where you cluster more points, the pieces will get smaller. As you have them spread out, the pieces get bigger, and this is why. Because the Voronoi is simply saying what region of space is closest